Welcome to TradeTheMBI.com. This is John. This report is for the 14th of April. Well, we got some of the weakness that we were expecting. It wasn't horrible. In fact, as soon as it came up against that previous lows from before, it bounced back pretty darn strong towards the end of the day. So it's like they pick the various algo levels, let them retrace, come back, and then they keep supporting on them at the key spots there. It still puts us very easily within that 50% zone, 2780, and it's just a matter of bouncing around at that. We were having rising red and green. Now you still have green escalating and improving slightly, and it's just a little bit below red. You've got the crossover of steel that took place coming below. That usually expresses a little more weakness than we're seeing. So, but we still have continued rising gold as well as azure here. Usually when those meet is your first opportunity for them to make the big call on whether they're going to fade or continue forward. This particular point, the shakeout is positive, so that becomes critical. As long as that histogram continues to rise, should stick with the trend. If it breaks it, then I think that's when you start to see a bit more cave. From an NQ standpoint, doing even better. Shot up above 50%, and then now it's actually approaching 61. So from performance-wise, the NASDAQ again outperforming. I think there were a lot of positive comments from the president the other day that I think bolstered this pre-market action, simply because they're talking about opening things up, and they didn't give specifics, but they were kind of hinting at it. You don't know if that's a little early on their talk, or they just realize that they've done a pretty amazing job at really keeping cases to a minimum, and it really isn't impacting the totality of the country yet. So as they're able to ramp up their testing and prepare for the antibody testing, I think they'll probably be ahead of everybody else as far as what they can and can't do. So I think that's a significant difference. Euro, of course, holding up with the support of the U.S. government. And, of course, we talked about this gold would break out, and there it goes. I think they even said stimulus checks were supposed to be arriving at any point, and they're talking about the agreements that they've reached with OPEC nations to limit supply. And that should help bolster oil some, which I think they're really intent on trying to support oil and keep it moving along. And from a 5K standpoint, I'd sent out the updated version of the Power 2, and you can see it has a little bit of the features in there where you can see that it changes color when you have the pivot. It doesn't quite do it right when you cross over yet. I hadn't gotten that far into the setup with it there. Also, you get two different versions. You get a gold tip versus the white one. And I detailed what those little consideration differences were. Let me fix the alignment on my chart here just a little bit. A little larger for everyone. And so we ended up with some softness. Now, it's interesting because for the dotted lines, you can just click Format. This becomes pretty straightforward. You click the inputs, and it says dotted lines. So if you don't want the dotted lines, you just put a 0 in there. And if you want the full range of the pivots to take place, then you could have turned Sigma off. And then when it reappears, there are no lines going on there. So we had some interesting little setups here. When a blue candle started off early, came just after a green pivot, which took place with the crossover. So this is one of those where these kind of conditions will look at what happened on the Power 2 and see if it's in a buy during that configuration, and that will determine whether or not it stays within that color. So that's the point of making the adaptations for indicator like this and that, to bring it out so that it's able to reconfirm. So likewise here with the yellow, we can see that likewise it started in by configuration and then boom, turned around quickly with the cell signal, and boom, stayed with that one and started to make some early little pops. So you had the little cyan right here, which means it dipped way below. That's like the super dip. That's down to 192. So it gets pretty darn low. It tends to try and pop from that particular point, but at that point you want to see a confirmation of orange dipping below your white to really give it that oomph. Now, from a Pink Bar 2 standpoint, as treating it as a trade, it didn't violate what would be the stop. So it continued down and then boom. And then we started talking about on our chat, literally right at this point when that white MBI shows up. And the white MBI is showing up at the same time that the confirmation from the MBI indicator and the specialty circumstances that I had created for it. And here you do get the dip. So you can see the difference between pretty close to identical readings. Even here, the orange didn't dip below red, so even that would have been a warning enough without utilizing the white line as that extra focal point. And then clearly when it came to the cell part, you can see red dips below the white, but it was also perfect DOC spread. And just the kind you kind of like here, where you have green coming from the top, orange spikes it below. What would have been ideal if this steel had been a little further over indented, then you would have expected a much bigger decline. But in this case, steel had already been reset, so it took a little while before it finally produced a little yellow candle right over there, which was still a decent run. And then once that buy came in, we literally started to see some much stronger shakeout, and then we started to get the Sigma events that were going through. And it's kind of an interesting one because the green rising above when you have the falling azure is typically bearish, but then it's followed not too shortly by the upside pivot, which means basically short algos, all their supply was getting sucked up, and then a much more bullish move of that both magenta and green dip, and that just gave you that nice orange dip below. And that led to the takeoff, and it's pretty much continued because every time you get these short signals where you get the pivot dipping below the 13, then the confirmation of the cross of magenta, it immediately flips around with an up pivot and continues the run. And then even here on the last one where it gave the pivot, you couldn't get a magenta to crossover, and that's kind of what we're in right now because we ended up with another. And you can see the price corresponds nicely. It does give up their little dips, but without that extra confirmation, they become very soft DOC spreads with nice resets of steel that turn around. Now, these are all producing positive extremes, so that gives you an idea of where the potential is during the day. But needless to say, it looks really good. So it's just a matter of finalizing some of these with and that was the point of creating the functions. And with these functions of creating the candles, we can go through and say, okay, I've got a yellow candle. Now, these are the criteria that I'm also looking for to determine whether this is more likely to be a longer run or one that doesn't have a DOC steel reset, where I'm going to have to be watching the interaction between the steel and cyan. So that just, it shows that even though you can have similar readings, they do have a different impact at different portions of the market. And this is something I've said all along when it comes to some of these setups, and particularly the problem with all the basic indicators that the regular world uses, where they're oscillating between a set zone. They can't identify the fact that there are different situations taking place within what appear to be similar readings. So I think it's important to be able to see that and just to point it out so that you're cognizant of it. But the ideal situation will be that we're able to adapt our colors that match those. And sometimes, because yes, it's a right call sometimes when you get a buy signal, but literally that can change in a couple of bars, and you have to be able enough to recognize that given what we see from the readings. And this is the dynamic of markets. Some people's minds can be changed in a pretty big hurry. So, as always, I will be on the Skype chat and updating you as I continue to make progress with these. But it's all good. Trade well. We'll talk to you later.